If you have a rental property, at some point you have to decide whether you want to manage it yourself or hire a property manager. But which one should you do? So in this video, we're going to talk about the pros and cons of hiring a property manager versus self-managing your property. We're going to talk about what does a property manager actually do, and it's a lot more than you might think. 2, what are the costs associated? So what's the actual breakdown of the cost that they're going to charge you if you choose to go with one? 3, should you actually do this or not? How do you actually weigh up the decision? And 4, I'm going to go over what I do for my properties, which are spread out over multiple states. And my name is Ray Corcoran. If you like videos like this, please consider subscribing, and of course, like the video because you just need to do it. So what does a property manager actually do? So the first thing that they do is manage rent. So they make sure the rent comes in, they make sure the rent is the correct amount. I've had instances where the rent for some reason was just changed in the middle of a cycle. Someone ended up transferring just less rent 1 week, and stuff like that needs to be spotted by a property manager. They also need to have keep the records on the rental ledger and provide receipts for that rent that has been paid. The next thing they need to do is manage tenant issues. So this could be tenants damaging the property, it could be unapproved pets, it could be unapproved tenants, so other randoms trying to live in the house. All those sorts of issues are managed typically by the property manager. You've also got stuff like negotiations with tenants. So if the rent's going to increase, they're the ones having that conversation and handling that with them. They also handle maintenance issues. So maintenance issues in terms of confirming what the actual issue is with the tenant. So lots of instances where the tenant goes, oh, this happened to me once. The oven wasn't working. And originally the property manager was like, we just need to replace the oven. But a good property manager will actually dig deeper to clarify what actually was wrong with it. And we've had instances where the stovetop didn't work, and then other times where just the knob, one of the knobs itself wasn't working, and it ended up going from being a $1,500 fix to being a $7 fix, a little bit of WD-40, and it started to actually turn again, and it's all working again. So confirming what the issue is very, very important, because you're the one that's going to be paying for it. So you need to be very, very clear and diagnose what's the actual problem, not what the surface level problem is for the tenant, because sometimes they're right and other times, they don't know what's wrong, but they just know that their stuff isn't working. When it comes to maintenance issues, confirming with the tenant what the problem is, then you have to go and find trades. Typically you'll get multiple quotes if you need to. If the price from the first guy comes back and it's very, very high, you may get secondary quotes. Often the property manager, a good property manager, will often have 2 or 3 people for each type of trade. So they've got backup options. Then after the work is actually completed, you have to go and confirm that the work has been done to a satisfactory standard and the tenant's happy. Then you need to pay the invoice and make sure that's all sorted out as well. Other things your property manager will typically do include inspections. They'll do viewings. If they're leasing out the property, they'll help you find tenants. They'll vet the tenants, which is a crucial one. A seasoned property manager is so invaluable at that time because they can really tell who's probably going to be a good or a bad tenant. Also getting them actually into the property once approved. So you've got stuff like bonds you need to handle. You need to handle lease agreements. You need to handle condition reports. So all that sort of stuff is handled by the property manager typically. You also need to be available on phone or email if any issues arise. So if you're self-managing, they might contact you at or they probably will contact you at very, very inconvenient times, but it's your responsibility to sort that out. You'll need to give notices of termination if that ever has to pop up. If you ever have to attend tribunal for any kind of dispute, then you'll have to go and attend that. And stuff like laws and legislation, you're going to need to be across the Tenancy Act. You're going to need to know what all these laws and rules are, especially the ones that are specific to your state. Now, if you do choose to self-manage, there are lots of courses online that you can do. Many of the real estate institutes in each different state, like say REIQ, for example, they have their own course, and many of them have their own courses, and there's also external providers that do courses on property management. And one other thing to keep in mind if you do plan on self-managing is that not all landlord insurance providers will insure when you are self-managed. So just keep that in mind. In terms of the cost to get a property manager, the cost will typically vary depending on the region that you're in, the rent that you're charging. Obviously, the higher the rent, the higher the fees associated with that, and also obviously the quality of the service. Some of the crapper providers might just cut their rates and then some of the better providers will typically charge for that. And my tip with this is whenever you are looking for a property manager, firstly speak to your network. So your mortgage broker, if you use a buyer's agent, they will often recommend one. And also I'd recommend contacting 3 different local property managers just to get a bit of a feel for what are the market rates in your area. The first main fee that you'll come across is the leasing fee. So to lease out a property, they'll typically charge 1 to 1.5 weeks of rent plus GST. Now obviously this varies. You can have some places that will charge 2 weeks rent or even more plus GST, and then you've got other people that will charge less. But for most of my properties, it's usually like 1 week, sometimes a week and a half of rent to lease that property out. Now that's typically for around a 12-month period. If you do end up, for whatever reason, renting your property out for say 2 years for some random reason, then some of the property managers will charge you for a 1 week of rent per 12-month period. Then you have the property management fee. So this can typically vary between 5.5% and 9.9%, including GST. So obviously there's people that charge more than 9.9. I haven't seen many people charge below 5.5. For me personally, most of my properties are around the 7%. And yeah, it really depends on what region. You know, some parts of WA, you can pay 9% and 10% and quite high fees. And then other parts of the country, you can pay 5 or 6, and it's quite common to do that. And don't forget, with any of these property managers, you can negotiate, and I recommend that you do negotiate within reason. Obviously, don't nickel and dime them. If they're a good provider, they're probably worth that money. But I always just ask the question if there's any wiggle room on that price, and quite often they'll knock a little bit off here and there. And if you do have multiple properties, obviously that can add up. Then you have the marketing or advertising costs. So when they have a property that they are going to go lease out, you pay the leasing fee, but they also charge you for the costs associated with marketing the property, because that's not, you know, they don't get to keep that money. The leasing fees for them, and then they have the marketing and advertising cost, and that includes putting the property for rent on realestate.com.au, Domain, Homely, rent.com.au. There's a whole bunch of different websites, and I guess every provider might do different websites, but they're kind of some of the bigger ones, and they'll put that on those websites. It'll also typically include a for lease sign out the front of the property if needed, not always, but that will sometimes be included. The marketing fee is typically, what I've seen, is around $250 to $400. Obviously you can vary outside of that, but generally I've seen most of the time I've been paying $250, $200, sometimes $300. The next fee that you're going to encounter is the photography fee. So this is typically for a property when you just started with a property manager and they want to get current, up-to-date, high-res, clear photos of what the property looks like, and hopefully, you know, showing it in quite a appealing light, so people do want to inquire and apply to rent there. This fee can vary, but it might be $150, $200, $250, maybe a bit more depending on how serious you want to get, but generally it's a couple of $100. There's a whole bunch of other little fees that are a bit smaller. Sometimes people will charge for an inspection fee, other times they just have it all inclusive and they just lump it all together. They don't actually, I guess, charge you additionally for that. There's also stuff like sheriff's fees. So if you have someone that has their rent in arrears and they need to boot them out or whatever it is, you will have to pay some sort of fee related to that. And some places charge a lease renegotiation fee, and some places, again, this always varies, but what I've seen quite commonly is around half a week of rent. The next question is, should you do this or not? So we've kind of covered all the things that a property manager does. We've kind of gone over the costs associated with doing that if you were to pay them to do it. And now the question is, really, should you bother doing this or not? So the first part is the cost. Now, if you have a property, most like smaller investment properties a lot of people will be around like the $400,000-$500,000 mark. So for this example, if you had a 500 grand property, and we'll keep simple numbers, you're renting it for $500, you're gonna be paying about $1,800, $1,900 at 7% in ongoing property management fees. So when you factor in all the other little fees as well, maybe it gets re-rented once throughout the year, then you're gonna have about, say, $2,000 to $3,000 for property management related costs for that type of property renting at that price. And note, that does exclude maintenance. I'm just talking for the property management, the main property management fees. For many people, you know, if they're not a professional property manager or they're not seriously interested in it, it doesn't make any sense for a lot of people to save $2,000 or $3,000. And as a semi-professional tight ass, I do love saving money. However, I do understand that my skills are not in property management. Could I learn it? Yeah, probably. Would I be terrible at it for a while? Yes. Is the risk higher than me just going out and working in my business and making that money back? Absolutely. So for me, it's just not worth me saving a couple of grand on fees, and I'll do the job worse, and I'll have a big distraction and multiple headaches throughout the year. For me, I love the fact that I can just pay them and it's done. The next factor is time. So you may be happy saving the money and you're loving it and you're happy to self-manage, but one of the tricky things about property management is, you may hear this a lot if you start to research this, it's all fine until it's not. And that is especially true for property management, because it's, it can be something where you can be lucky, you get good tenants, and you're kind of on a good run. And there's many people potentially watching this video that have a self-managed investment property and it's been great for a while. And that's fantastic and I'm happy for you, but there's also situations where the tenants aren't great and it might go from being no work and then spiking up and being heaps of work all of a sudden. Another thing to consider is when a good property manager looks after your property, the average length of stay, the average rental amount that they can get is much higher. The vacancy time goes down. They can normally lease stuff quicker than you can. So all of these benefits a good property manager can achieve for you, and that will negate majority, if not all, of the fees that you would save by self-managing it. And that's not even taking into account the time that you'd be spending on it. And one thing that I want to delineate here is there's probably three main categories that you need to look at. There is managing it yourself, there's a crap property manager, and then there's a good property manager. So the crap property manager is the worst of both worlds because you still have to do a bunch of work and you don't even save that much money. A good property manager is worth their weight in gold and worth trying to find and keep the search for that person. Don't give up trying to find that person, because it's amazing when you have it. And then there's of course the self-managed option. I would say for 95% of people that they should really consider pursuing a good property manager. And sometimes that will be, and often it will actually not be the cheapest option. I've gone with some of the cheapest options before, sounded great on paper, low rate, all good. And it was fine for many months in a row until it wasn't, and it was horrendous. And ultimately they were missing rent that should have come through, and the tenant forgot, or who knows what actually happened. But I just calculated it one day and I was like, that number looks wrong. And then I raised it with them and they go, oh yeah, you're right. It was actually missing rent, and it all get fixed up, no problem. But the fact that they don't even look at it. Also, the amount of issues that I had situations where the tenants were getting annoyed because stuff wasn't getting fixed, but I was telling the property manager to go get a quote and they weren't getting a quote, or they were taking several days. I would email them to go get a quote, and then it'll be 5 days, then they would ask for the quote, then another few days for them to actually get the quote. And then, this whole timeline of the tenant asking for something to be fixed and actually getting fixed was huge. And it was just drawn out because the property manager was disorganized and they were terrible. And for that particular property, I'm now with another property manager who is so much better. The tenant's happier and the property manager is all over it. I know that they know everything that's going on, and they raise issues with me immediately, and they handle stuff and they have initiative, and it's fantastic. You also need to consider, if you're not going to be doing the inspections, who's going to be doing the inspections. So if you're, for me, my properties are spread out over multiple states. So I can't be a local area expert on multiple different areas. Maybe if you're someone that has a number of properties in one particular city or area, doesn't really make sense from a diversification point of view, but maybe you just like to buy in your home city, for example. Maybe you could do it, and maybe you do get economies of scale when you're managing 5, 6, 7 plus properties. But for most people, if they've got one investment property or 2 or 3 or whatever, and especially if they're quite spread out, can you manage it? Probably, but is it worth it? In my opinion, probably not. In terms of what I do, I have always gone for the default of having a property manager. I have zero interest in learning about how to be a property manager. Could I probably do it? Absolutely. It's a huge time cost. For me, I make more money working in my business and growing my business and servicing my customers than for me trying to save 2 or 3 grand by managing one property by myself. And I've got multiple, so then I'd have to, I have to be spending, I might save 2 or 3 grand each property, but then I've got to spend however many hours throughout the year, stressful phone calls, BS, very low level micro emails about this tap doesn't work or whatever, to save what, 2 grand per property, 3 grand per property. It's not a small amount of money, but the opportunity cost for me is much greater. I could be missing out on 50,000 bucks in revenue if I just focused on what I'm good at and what I've got skills and expertise in. There's no point in me trying to be a hero in the business and then also be some sort of property management whiz as well. So what do you think? Do you think self-managed property is the way to go, or do you think a property manager is the way to go? If you have any thoughts about it, have you tried one versus the other? Have you had any experiences with either option? Let me know below in the comments. I'd love to hear about it. And other than that, I'll see you on the next video.